In a luxurious wedding reception, the groom's words about his father-in-law shattered the family. "He's always been a burden," he said. Those words felt like a knife straight into the heart of the father, who stood there helpless. But what happens when a father is openly disrespected, forced to face the silence of his own daughter? Can patience and love heal all wounds? This story is not just about betrayal, but also about a challenging question: is patience and love enough to heal deeply ingrained scars? Follow this family's story, where things are not always as they seem on the surface. The wedding banquet, with the sparkling light from the chandeliers hanging gracefully from the ceiling, cast its glow upon the white tablecloths, the tall, glimmering crystal glasses, creating a magnificent and luxurious atmosphere. Everything from the towering wedding cake to the fresh, vibrant flowers in crystal vases was carefully and elegantly arranged. This space not only symbolized love, but also represented wealth, power, and a promising future. While everyone was seated at the tables, laughing, chatting, and enjoying the delicious food, the groom and bride stood in the middle of the hall, drawing all eyes to them. Their eyes were filled with happiness and pride. Yet there was also an underlying sense of complacency, especially from the groom. He, with his handsome appearance and elegant attire, tightly holding his glass of wine, began to speak as though he wanted to make his mark on the event with a special speech. Everyone stopped, and all eyes turned towards the groom. He lifted his glass, looked lovingly at his bride, and then turned to the guests, his lips curling into a self-satisfied smile, as though preparing for an important statement. The music from the distant orchestra softened, leaving only the sounds of spoons clinking on plates and the overwhelming silence in the air. "Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here on our special day. And most importantly, I must thank my father-in-law, the very special man in my life," the groom began, his voice resonating, gentle yet carrying pride. "I am deeply grateful to him for teaching me a valuable financial lesson. The greatest lesson he passed down to me is never go bankrupt like he did." A few guests let out nervous chuckles, but the atmosphere no longer felt natural. A terrifying silence filled the space. The forced smiles of the guests, their half-hearted expressions, failed to mask their discomfort. Some tried to shift the mood by continuing to drink or chat, but their eyes quickly darted between each other, as though they all recognized the biting sarcasm in the groom's words. However, there was one person in the room who could not pretend like the others: the father. He was seated at a distant corner of the banquet table, his eyes never lifting, remaining silent like a solitary shadow in the grand space. But in that moment, the entire room seemed to pause with him. Each word from the groom, even if meant as a joke, felt like a knife piercing his heart. He could not ignore it. He could not feel the sting of each jest, each insult that dug deep into his pride. No one likely noticed, but for him, that moment felt like a shock. The jokes weren't just mockery of his financial situation, they were a humiliation of everything he had done in his life. He had been the pillar of his family, the husband, the father who always tried to provide the best for his family. He had faced numerous hardships, endured pain, and fought through great challenges to protect his family. Yet, now, all he received was this disdain from someone he had once considered his son-in-law, the man who was supposed to care for his daughter for the rest of her life. But the most painful thing was Emma, his daughter. She stood beside the groom, holding his hand tightly, smiling with happiness, completely unaware of the harm caused. She didn't know that her husband's words had hurt the father, who stood alone in the dark. She didn't realize that this jest not only attacked the pride of a man, but was also a painful betrayal of the love her father had for her. Emma just smiled, still bright and carefree. She didn't notice the glances around her, the furtive looks from the guests, and especially the terrifying silence from her father. She was lost in her own joy. But at the moment, the father could only look at his daughter with a heart full of sorrow. His gaze followed her, full of love, but also disappointment. His eyes no longer saw admiration in her gaze, only distance. He was no longer the hero in her eyes. All the sacrifices he had made, the sleepless nights he spent worrying about the family, now seemed forgotten in the careless jests being made. The father's hand clenched tightly beneath the table. His fingers dug into one another as if to hold on to whatever calm remained. His body trembled, not from anger, but from the deep disappointment and pain in his heart. He couldn't speak, couldn't react. That was something he had grown accustomed to, silently enduring, accepting everything. But what the father could not endure was the silence from his daughter. That silence was like a mirror reflecting back at him, a man who had once been a hero in her eyes, now reduced to just a silent shadow in her life. When the groom's speech ended, Emma turned to look at her husband with a sweet gaze. She didn't notice that her father was holding his breath like an invisible ghost. She thought it was just a harmless joke, a light moment on her wedding day. But for the father, this was the moment he realized everything had changed. What he had spent his life building, protecting, and sacrificing for had now been shattered in a single joke by a man he once considered his son-in-law, the man who was supposed to walk through life with his daughter. While no one was paying attention, the father quietly stood up, left the banquet table, and silently walked out of the hall, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Each step felt like carrying an unbearable sorrow. At that moment, he just wanted to get away from everything, away from the pretension, away from the smiles that he knew he no longer had the right to enjoy. Silently, he stepped outside, where the dim lights shone on the vast garden. The wedding banquet was held in an elegant space where the light from the dazzling chandeliers cast a mystical, sparkling aura. The air was filled with the fragrance of fresh flowers, the scent of delicious food, and the soft sounds of classical music rising from the orchestra. Each drop of deep red amber wine was poured into crystal glasses, and the light from them reflected onto the ceiling like precious gems. The atmosphere of this wedding was not just opulent, but also an exhibition of the complete joy the newlywed couple felt, surrounded by family, friends, and acquaintances, all present to celebrate a new beginning. But amidst the congratulations, bright smiles, and warm handshakes, there stood one man outside the spotlight, like a silent ghost in the crowd. He was the father of the bride, the man who had spent his entire life protecting and loving his family. In his eyes, everything seemed to blur as he heard the mocking words from his son-in-law, meaningless jokes uttered from the mouth of the man he once considered a son, someone who would care for and protect his daughter for the rest of her life. The groom stood up, holding his wine glass, and in the solemn atmosphere of the banquet, he began to speak, his voice sweet and gentle, but laced with contempt that no one noticed. All the guests' eyes were fixed on him. His words seemed to aim at leaving a mark on everyone's mind, but not a mark of respect or gratitude. He said, "Thank you all for coming to celebrate with us on our special day. And especially, I want to thank my father-in-law, the very special man in my life. I am so grateful to him for teaching me a valuable financial lesson. The greatest lesson he passed on to me is never go bankrupt like he did." These words were not a harmless joke. They were a direct insult, a degradation not just of his financial situation, but of his character and the value he had carried throughout his life. The father, sitting silently in the corner of the room, stared at his son-in-law, but couldn't say a word. His eyes were marked by disappointment, pain, and the humiliation he had to endure. The entire room seemed to fall silent, and though the weak laughter of the guests rang out, no one could escape the suffocating atmosphere enveloping the room. The laughter from the guests was nothing but a formality, forced, unable to mask the discomfort, the furtive glances, the concerned furrows of brows between the guests. Everyone sensed that something was wrong in the air, but no one spoke up. Certainly, no one dared to voice the truth, because in moments like these, silence was the safest choice. The father, though standing in his shadow, felt his gaze become sharp, touching every word from the groom. He felt as though everything in his life was being denied in that very moment. What he had sacrificed, the hardships he had endured throughout his long life, were now tarnished by those thoughtless words. What he had never anticipated, what he had never imagined, had now become reality. A public insult on the very day his daughter was married, a celebration that was meant to be joyful, had now turned into an irreparable wound. But in that moment, what the father felt most was the silence of his daughter. Emma stood there, her eyes filled with happiness and pride. She didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to realize, the pain her father was enduring. She couldn't understand that her joyful smiles, her firm handshakes with the groom, were inadvertently breaking her father's heart even more. Every time she smiled, every time she spoke to her husband, she became more distant from the father she had once loved and admired. When the father looked at his daughter, he didn't just see a glowing bride. He saw the image of a little girl, the child he had carried in his arms, the one he had taught and protected. He remembered the old days when his little girl had trusted him completely, had looked at him like a hero. But now he was just a father left in the dark, with eyes no one could see, and a heart no one could understand. What he had done, what he had sacrificed, was now reduced to careless jokes, to contempt from the very person he had hoped would protect and care for his daughter. Emma, in that moment, still didn't realize. She still stood beside the groom, her hand tightly holding his, smiling brightly. She didn't understand that when she smiled like that, her father, the man who had sacrificed his entire life for her, had to suppress those painful emotions inside. His eyes had blurred with tears, but he couldn't let them fall. His hands, though clenched tightly under the table, still trembled with the deep pain in his heart. In that moment, all his feelings were poured into a single thought. What am I in their eyes? What am I in my daughter's eyes? A silence enveloped him, and he didn't know what to do or what to say. All he could do was force a smile like a mask, hiding all the emotions behind it. That mask wasn't happiness, but acceptance of the pain, acceptance that he could no longer change anything. The groom's words, the reactions of his daughter, all were wounds he could never erase. And he had no choice but to accept it, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other option. The old kitchen in the father's house no longer holds the bustling energy of family meals, nor the laughter of children or the familiar sense of home-cooked dishes. Everything has sunk into a quiet, still space, much like the memories the father silently faces. Each plate, each spoon in the kitchen cupboard is covered in a thin layer of dust, a testament to the days gone by, to the meals he no longer looks forward to. This kitchen, once the heart of family dinners, now feels like an empty, lonely, and gloomy place. The weak light from the pale yellow ceiling lamp cast a soft glow, making everything in the room seem to blur into the darkness, as if trying to hide the sadness and the unspoken silence. The father sat alone at the wooden table, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, but he didn't even notice. His eyes were dull and tired, as though he no longer had the strength to look at anything. His heart was too weary to continue enduring, to continue smiling weakly in front of others, when all he wanted was to find a corner where he could hide his pain and disappointment. Over the past few years, this house had become empty. His children had grown up and moved on with their own lives. Family dinners no longer existed. Only he remained, silently, alone in this kitchen. Looking back at the past, he couldn't help but remember the days when the family gathered together, the sounds of children laughing, the clink of plates and glasses, the warm, hearty meals. Those days, though difficult and full of struggles, had brought him happiness, as he saw his children happy and felt like the father who could protect his family from life's trials. But now, everything had changed. All he could do now was sit quietly in the empty kitchen, reflecting on the memories that could never return. He stood up, feeling his tired legs, as if every step was heavier than ever. He walked toward the old wooden cabinet, which held all his precious mementos, the relics of a past full of sacrifice and effort. The wooden cabinet had yellowed with age, its surface scratched with small marks, as if bearing the signs of time, the marks of sleepless nights working hard to provide for his children. The cabinet door creaked open as he pulled it, releasing the smell of aged wood and a slight mustiness, as if the air inside had been covered by the thin layer of dust from years of neglect. His fingers lightly brushed over the old items inside the cabinet, feeling as though each object held a story, a memory he could never forget. The silver medal, the certificate of achievement, the old family photographs. These were all witnesses to a time when he was the strong man, the father his children admired, the loving husband. But now, all these mementos held no value to anyone but him. Everything seemed meaningless as he looked at the photographs, realizing that the people he loved no longer needed him as they once had. His fingers gently traced the old photograph, the one he used to look at whenever he felt weary. It was a photo from a sunny summer day when Emma was just a little girl, around 3 years old. She was wearing a cute floral dress, her big innocent eyes gazing up at him, her smile radiant. In the photo, he was holding Emma in his arms, his face full of love and protection. That was the moment when he felt like a hero in his daughter's eyes, the only father she trusted. Those moments were precious and sacred to him, for they were proof of the boundless love he had for his family. But now, looking at that photo, he felt a pain that words could not describe. The photo was not just a memory of happier times, but a deep regret. The feeling of seeing himself in that photo, once a strong and resilient man, now seemed to stand in the shadows, no longer recognized as a hero. All the sacrifices he made, the sleepless nights, the sweat he shed, now held no meaning for Emma. She no longer saw him as a hero. She had not realized the pain he was carrying. The father gently stroked the photo as if he were afraid that if he stopped for even a moment, the photo would disappear. His fingers trembled as they lightly touched the face of the little girl in the picture. He sighed, his voice shaking, caught in his throat. "You used to call me your hero." These words weren't an accusation, but a self-reminder, a lament for a love forgotten, for a father no longer seen as before. The old memories flashed in his mind like a slow-motion film, each scene, each happy moment when Emma was just a little child, running into his arms, trusting him unconditionally. Every time he held her, every time she called him hero, he felt like he could overcome any difficulty in life. He felt like the strongest man in the world because he had his daughter by his side and because she trusted him. But now, looking at the photo, he realized that everything had changed. The daughter he had loved and protected for so many years no longer needed him. She had her own life now, with another man to trust and love. She no longer needed him, and that shattered his heart. All his sacrifices, all his efforts now seemed meaningless. He was no longer the hero in his daughter's eyes, no longer the father she always admired. He was just a lonely man sitting in an empty kitchen, facing a past he could never return to. His voice shook again, this time not just from the pain, but from the deep hurt in his heart. He placed the photo back into the drawer, where it would rest quietly, shrouded in darkness, just like all the painful memories he could not change. Then he stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to think. The tears began to fall, but he could not hold them back. He cried, not because of weakness, but because of the unspeakable pain, because of sacrifices made in vain, because the father was no longer the hero. The garden behind the old house had been a part of the father's life for many years. It wasn't a vast piece of land, only a few 100 square meters, but to him it was the only place left where he could find some peace amidst the pain and loss. Every morning, before the sun had risen, the father would walk to the garden, his steps slow and weary, to tend to the rose bushes he had planted, to care for the flowers he had nurtured over the years. This rose garden was not only a place where he grew flowers, but also where he nurtured hope, where he poured out the emotions and feelings he couldn't put into words. Each flower, each rose was tied to a memory, a story. The red roses symbolized the passionate, burning love he had for his late wife. The pure white roses were symbols of the purity and love he felt for his daughter, while the yellow roses, like sunlight, always bloomed resiliently. Despite facing hardships and challenges, they were like messages he sent to his daughter, whether she understood them or not, whether she ever returned or not. When spring came, the rose garden bloomed with vibrant colors. The deep red roses like fiery flames, the white roses like snow, and the yellow roses proudly stretching towards the sky. Every time he passed the garden, the father could feel a sense of warmth, a sense of peace. However, every time he saw the flowers in full bloom, he couldn't help but feel a wave of loneliness rising in his heart. He tended to the garden every day, trimming, watering, worrying about the pests eating the leaves, the strong winds that could cause the petals to fall. He told himself that as long as he did this, the garden would remain beautiful. It would continue to exist fully. But the garden was no longer shared with anyone. There were no more laughs, no more hands to help him tend to it. That was what he felt the most, the absence. This rose garden was also a legacy from his late wife. She had been the one to plant the roses, the one who cared for them as she did for their family. She had left him a garden full of color, full of love, but also full of pain. Every time he looked at the garden, the father couldn't help but remember the happy days when she was still alive. Together, they had cared for each flower, watched the rose bushes grow, the heavy branches laden with blooms, and together they had felt the joy of seeing the entire garden come to life. But now, all those moments were nothing but memories. Every time he saw the roses bloom, a deep sense of longing filled his heart. These flowers, with their vibrant life, made him feel as if he were living in a different world, a world where he no longer had a companion. The flowers seemed like gifts from his late wife, a fulfillment of the promises she had made to him. Take care of this rose garden as we took care of our family. And he had done so day after day, hour after hour, but now he was alone. Some evenings, as the last light of the day began to fade, he would stand in the garden, his eyes following each bloom, each leaf as if searching for something, something lost but not entirely gone. He couldn't stop thinking about the wife who had passed, those days when she was still with him, when they held hands tending to the garden, when they shared their dreams and hopes. But now, with her gone, he felt like a stranger in his own home. The rose garden, those blooming flowers, now seemed to hold no meaning. Something was lost. Some piece of completeness was gone. Then he would glance toward his daughter's house, just a short distance from the garden. The door to her house remained shut. The entire house seemed lifeless. It was the home where he had once helped his daughter decorate, where they had shared meals and precious family moments, but now it felt like a desolate place with no laughter, no warmth of family. That emptiness cut deep into his heart. His daughter, it seemed, had become a stranger to him, even though she was just a few steps away from the garden. Each time he looked at her house, his heart would tighten. How long had it been since Emma last visited? How long had it been since she took time for him, since they sat together for tea, since she asked about the rose garden he had cared for all these years? He didn't know. He only knew that her house now stood as cold walls, no longer filled with her presence, no longer echoing with the warm laughter of family. But in those moments, the father couldn't stop hoping. He stood there amidst the blooming garden, his gaze still fixed on his daughter's house, his eyes filled with trust, with hope, even though everything had changed. "My daughter will come back," he whispered to himself, though he knew no one could predict the future. "One day she will return, and I will not give up." He knew that despite the moments of sadness, despite the times when it seemed like everything was falling apart, he would continue to tend the garden. It was the only place where he could find solace, peace. Every flower, every rose was a reminder of the love he had for his daughter, for his family. From now on, he would continue to do what he always did, tend to the garden, wait, hope. He couldn't do anything else but preserve the memories of his family in each flower, in every breeze that passed through the garden. No matter how long it took, The rose garden would continue to bloom, like a blessing from him to his daughter. Hope remained, even though her door remained shut. On that day, like any other ordinary day, the father sat silently in the living room of his home, a place once filled with the laughter and conversations of family. His hands gripped a cup of tea, staring into the warm sips he had prepared. The steam rose gently from the cup, wafting into the air, yet nothing could chase away the coldness in his heart. The house now felt empty, void of laughter, only filled with dull silence that hung over the space like an invisible curtain. Emma's groom had arrived. The son-in-law, whom he had once considered as a son, the one he hoped would care for and protect his daughter. But today, as with all previous encounters, the groom brought nothing but distance and coldness. He walked into the house, not sparing a single glance at the father. Instead, he was engrossed in his phone, as though everything around him no longer mattered. Each step, each motion of his was a clear display of disrespect. The way he entered the room, sat down without a word, without greeting, made the father feel invisible. The father couldn't help but feel the indifference in his eyes, yet he remained still, holding the teacup steadily, without rushing. A choking feeling welled up inside him, as if all the years of devotion and unconditional sacrifice had become worthless in the eyes of this son-in-law. He said nothing. It was his habit, silent, enduring, because he understood that in a family, not everything could be spoken aloud. But silence didn't mean it didn't hurt. It only deepened the wound in his heart, stretching it longer, further. The groom didn't bother putting down his phone, not even a glance in the father's direction. The space between them felt like an invisible gap, growing wider with each passing second. The father stood up, his eyes still on his son-in-law, but he couldn't do anything. The feeling of being abandoned, forgotten, weighed heavily on his heart. Trying to mask those emotions, he walked slowly to the tea kettle and poured tea into 2 cups. The steam rose, thin tendrils of smoke, but nothing could dissipate the emptiness inside him. With every slow movement, the father seemed to want to stretch the time, as though if he just had a little more time, he would find the words to speak, find a way to bridge the silence. But no. The groom still didn't stop scrolling through his phone. No greetings, no questions about his well-being, no thanks after receiving the cup of tea. He simply sat there, silent and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. After a while, the groom looked up briefly, glancing at the father, but it was just a passing glance, without a hint of care. Then, as if to break the heavy silence, he casually uttered a light joke, though it carried an undeniable air of contempt. "Father-in-law, if you tried working again, life might be more meaningful, huh?" That remark wasn't just a joke, it was a blatant insult, a dismissive judgment he couldn't deny. The groom said it so nonchalantly, yet it struck the father like a slap to the face. Every word was laced with disdain, with contempt. Life might be more meaningful. That phrase wasn't just a jab at his finances or his life. It was a complete denial of his worth. In the groom's eyes, the father seemed like a man past his prime, someone with no place in today's modern world. The father heard the words, but he couldn't respond. They echoed in his head like a knife cutting into his heart. He felt a lump rise in his throat, choking him, but he couldn't speak. All the emotions, humiliation, pain, and helplessness poured into his chest. He had dedicated his life to his family, to building a home, yet now all he received was disdain from the very son-in-law he had trusted. The father looked at the cup of tea in his hand, but all he saw was the silence in his own eyes. He poured the tea for the groom, but there was no gratitude, no gesture of appreciation. Everything seemed like a duty, just automatic actions he had learned over the years. The groom didn't care about the pain in the father's eyes. He simply took the cup, drank a sip, then returned to his phone. What was the father feeling in that moment? It was deep disappointment. The realization that all he had done for the family, all the sacrifices he had made, were not recognized. He had once thought his daughter would always see him as a hero, that his son-in-law would regard him as a man of value. But now all that remained was indifference, cruel words spoken lightly, without hesitation. The lump in the father's throat was something he couldn't swallow. The son-in-law's words were a wound that couldn't heal, an offense he could not fight back against. Yet he remained silent once again, because he knew that no matter how he responded, no matter what he said, it wouldn't change the fact that he was nothing but a ghost in the lives of his daughter and son-in-law. The father sat there in the cold room, in the terrifying silence. The air around him was heavy, and he felt like he had been forgotten, like a part of the past with no value anymore. With each encounter, he realized more and more that he was being left behind. No matter how much he tried to endure, no matter how he tried to stay silent, the pain still burned within him, unerasable. The soft yellow light from the ceiling lamp gradually stretched the shadows down, filling the quiet space of the house. On a late afternoon, the father sat silently at the dining table, once the center of warm meals and lively family conversations. But now, the simple wooden table was just a relic of times gone by. The room remained unchanged, but a sense of stillness had taken over everything. No longer were there sounds of his daughter's laughter, no more stories about school days, work, or future dreams. All that was left was a cold, empty space where the father felt like a ghost, standing on the sidelines of his daughter's life. The father's eyes were fixed on the cup of tea in front of him. Each sip of tea seemed to seep into his soul, but it couldn't melt the chill that surrounded his heart. He had dedicated his whole life to taking care of his family, to providing a good life for his daughter, but now he felt forgotten, left behind. His hands, thin and aged, gently held the cup, but inside there was a deep sense of unease. He no longer felt important in his daughter's eyes. The door opened and Emma stepped in, her face lit up with a radiant smile. She entered like a fresh breeze, bright and full of energy. Her light footsteps echoed in the space, but no matter how hard she tried, the father couldn't shake the feeling of distance between them. Emma saw him sitting there, his eyes filled with sadness, but she didn't notice. She didn't know that everything had changed, that between them now lay a gap that could never be bridged. "Dad," Emma said, her voice lively, like a joyful wave sweeping away her worries. "He says I'm the most successful woman in his life." Her words echoed in the room like a statement of pride, a confirmation that she had chosen the right path, that she had found happiness and success in her life. Emma stood there, holding her purse, her eyes filled with joy as she shared her achievements with her father. It was a moment of pride for her, a moment she hoped her father would share in her happiness. But to the father, those words were like a cold splash of water to his heart. Every word from his daughter felt like a reminder of the change, of how he was gradually losing his place in her life. The praise from her husband, from her family, made him feel like an outsider, someone who no longer had a role in his daughter's life. He looked into her eyes, but he couldn't see the joy she expected him to see. Instead, he felt an overwhelming pain, a deep sense of loss. "You're the most successful woman in his life." Those words echoed in his mind, like knives cutting into his heart. The father didn't want to ruin this moment for Emma, didn't want to make her sad, but inside he felt like everything was breaking apart. She looked at him with pride for her husband, for the life she had, but he felt like a fading shadow, no longer significant to her. What did I do wrong? The father wondered. He never wanted his daughter to sacrifice what she had, but he couldn't help but feel a deep ache seeing Emma happy in the distance between them. How many years had he devoted? How many sleepless nights had he spent working to provide for the family? And now he was left alone in this house, watching his daughter drift farther away. Emma continued, still unaware of the change in her father's attitude. "He says I'm strong, that I'm the only one who makes him proud." "I feel so lucky to have him, Dad." The father looked at her, offering a forced smile, trying not to let his emotions take over. That smile wasn't happiness, it was silent acceptance. He didn't want to spoil his daughter's happiness. He didn't want to make her sad, but in his eyes, in his every gesture, there was a sadness that she couldn't see. She was still beaming, still full of joy as she spoke about her husband, about the life she thought was perfect. but he couldn't feel the shared connection with her anymore. The father slowly stood up, turning away slightly, as if trying to hide the pain rising within him. He couldn't look Emma in the eye when she spoke about her happiness. His eyes were filled with sorrow, but he tried to hide it from her. He didn't want her to feel the absence in his heart. In that moment, Hollow's silence. Silence was his way of protecting his daughter, of protecting the joy she was having. He couldn't shatter that happiness with words she couldn't understand. But as he turned away, the father knew that he couldn't stop the emptiness in his heart. He had once been a hero in his daughter's eyes, the father she trusted and loved, but now he was just a ghost in her life. She didn't see it, didn't recognize the change in him. She didn't realize that every time she spoke about her success, her happiness, he felt himself being pushed further away. He didn't blame her, but it still broke his heart. And that was the moment the father chose silence. He understood that in his daughter's life, he was just a part of the past, a part she had left behind. But he still loved her, still protected her, even though she didn't recognize it. And he accepted that distance just so she could continue to be happy. Even though his heart was shattered, he chose silence, standing on the sidelines of her life, so as not to ruin the happiness she had. Silence, though painful, was his way of loving his daughter. That evening's dinner was simple, yet complete, like the family meals of the past. The father stood quietly in the kitchen, his hands rough from years of hard work, skillfully stirring the soup in silence. The sound of the spoon tapping against the pot echoed, but it couldn't drown out the heavy thoughts building up in his mind. Since his daughter's marriage, family meals had no longer been what they once were. Simple conversations had now turned into silences, moments when he felt like an outsider. The son-in-law came for dinner as usual, but the father sensed something different this time. He entered the house dressed smartly, his hair perfectly styled with gel, but he didn't give the father a single friendly glance, nor a polite nod that a guest might usually offer. The son-in-law simply gave a small nod and sat down at the table, immediately returning to his phone, scrolling through notifications as if neither the father nor Emma existed in that space. The father felt a lack of respect from the very beginning, but he tried to swallow that discomfort. He didn't want to make the meal tense, didn't want to disrupt the fragile harmony that had been maintained. But the more he observed his son-in-law's attitude, the more exhausted he felt. He knew that no matter how many attempts he made, their relationship could never return to what it had been. His house was no longer a warm, family-centered place, but a space filled with unspoken conflicts, misunderstandings that had yet to be addressed. As the meal began, the atmosphere was initially quiet. Everyone ate, but no one truly conversed. Emma occasionally glanced toward her husband, her eyes full of love and pride. She tried to find moments in the conversation to gain her father's attention, but he could only smile weakly, trying to prevent the silence from spreading. The son-in-law, sitting at the end of the table, occasionally looked up from his phone before returning to the screen. At one point, he couldn't stop smirking as he mentioned something about work to Emma, but in the father's eyes, it no longer seemed like a funny story. The son-in-law laughed casually, but the father could feel the coldness and contempt in his tone, even if the words weren't meant to be malicious. In this context, to the father, they felt like an insult. After a while, the son-in-law suddenly spoke, still not looking up from his phone, but this time his voice had a sharper edge, as if he no longer cared about maintaining decorum. "Father-in-law," he said, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, "if you tried working again, maybe your life would have more meaning, huh? After all, having a stable job is probably better than just staying home and gardening all day." The words from the son-in-law were no longer a joke. They felt like a judgment, a clear contempt. The statement struck the father's heart like an arrow. All the years of hard labor, the sleepless nights spent working tirelessly to provide a better life for his family, were now dismissed as meaningless, as a waste. His sacrifices were replaced with derision, his efforts completely invalidated. The father swallowed the lump in his throat, unable to say a word. His eyes were fixed on the bowl of rice before him, his hand gripping the spoon tightly, but he couldn't lift it to eat. He could only sit there in silence, hearing the laughter of his son-in-law echoing in the space, hearing the disrespect in each word but unable to respond. Emma, sensing the silence between them, didn't immediately understand the situation. She didn't notice the tension in the air, didn't feel the hurt her father was enduring. She just thought her husband was joking, that it was all part of the new life she had with him, and she only wanted everyone to enjoy the meal together. But when she looked at her father's eyes, she suddenly realized that the silence wasn't agreement. It was hurt. When the father finally looked up, he could no longer hold back the pain. He could only utter a single sentence with all the restraint he could muster, all the sorrow in his heart. "You know nothing about sacrifice." Those words were like a small scream within the father's heart, a question he could no longer hold back. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment, the exhaustion of living in silence for so many years. He didn't just want to protect his daughter, he also wanted to remind his son-in-law of the value of the sacrifices he had made his entire life, of the hardships he had endured to give his family a better life. But his words only thickened the air in the room, making it feel suffocating, tense. The entire room fell silent, as if nothing existed except the heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Emma was confused, her eyes wide, unsure of how to react. She hadn't thought that her husband's words would hurt her father so deeply. She turned to her husband, then back to her father, her eyes shifting from surprise to anger. She had never seen her father speak like this before. "You're embarrassing me in front of my husband," Emma said, her voice suddenly tight and angry. "You don't understand anything." He was just joking. Her words hit the father like a shock. He looked at her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears, but he couldn't cry. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was no longer an important part of his daughter's life. Even though he had given everything to raise her, to protect her, now she couldn't understand the pain he was enduring. The father stood still, unable to respond, unable to explain, unable to do anything. He just stood there, staring into his daughter's eyes, realizing that between them lay an insurmountable distance. A distance not born of love, not born of hatred, but of time, of differences that couldn't be adjusted, of the silence he had chosen. He knew that no one could understand his feelings, and he didn't want to make his daughter suffer with words he could never say. In that moment, the father could only remain silent, for he understood that sometimes silence was the only way to protect the ones he loved. But that silence was also a pain too deep to describe. The room remained still, and the atmosphere hung heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. The outside world remained still, a deep night covering every corner of the house. From within the room, the father sat in silence, the darkness slowly stretching over him, like a veil that shielded emotions he could no longer express. All that could be heard in the room was the ticking of the clock on the nearby wall, each tick echoing like the beat of his heart. But with each passing second, those beats grew weaker, heavier, and more distant. That space seemed to reflect the father's entire emotional state. All that he had devoted his life to for his family now seemed like fading traces, painful memories that no one remembered anymore. He was exhausted from holding his silence, weary from accepting the role of a ghost in his daughter's life, in the life of his late wife. He had given all his love, all his sacrifices, day and night, to build a home, a stable family, but now all he received in return was coldness, cruelty, while his wife had left him forever, with no more words of love or shared moments. Now his daughter too had entered a different world, a world where he no longer had a place. The tears he hadn't dared shed for so many years now came like a downpour. He wanted to cry, but couldn't. Those tears had been buried through the long years, not because he didn't feel, but because he had grown too accustomed to hiding his emotions. He stood up, his tired, aged legs slowly carrying him out to the garden. His footsteps made soft sounds as he walked across the small pebbles of the path leading to the garden, but the sound couldn't fill the emptiness in his soul. Everything around him was silent, except for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the sound of his own steps. He felt nothing but the heavy weight in his chest. The garden before him had not changed much. The rose garden his wife had planted, tended to, was still blooming, like a testament to her love and sacrifice. Though his wife had passed away, this garden still existed as a part of the memory, a part of the life she had left behind. She had loved this garden, loved every flower, every rose she had taken care of, and so had he. Every morning, he still tended to it, still watered each plant, still pruned the dry branches, still worried about the pests eating the leaves. But now, everything felt incomplete. This garden was not only a part of the love his wife had planted, but also a symbol of the sadness, the emptiness he now felt. The father stopped in front of the large rose bush, the one his wife had cared for with all her love. The bush still stood firm, its branches still reaching up, its flowers still blooming. But in his heart, nothing was solid anymore. Everything seemed to be falling into an endless void, a place where no one had the strength to pull it back. He placed his hand on the rose bush, feeling the coldness from the bark. The bush was still vibrant, but to him it felt like his own heart, wilted, hollow. All the years he had spent giving his strength and love to his family now felt like they had been in vain. A sense of helplessness flooded through him. He felt like a person who had lost himself, as if his sacrifices had meant nothing in the eyes of those he loved the most. And then, as he touched the trunk, his fingers brushing over the rough bark, a tear unexpectedly fell, the first tear after so many long years. He began to cry, something he had never allowed himself to do, revealing his weakness. The entire garden seemed to go still in that moment. The father, who had been strong and resilient for so many years, could no longer hold back the emotions that had been building up inside him. He couldn't stop the tears that ran down his face, as if all those years of silence, of endurance, had finally reached their breaking point. He had lived a long life, full of sacrifices, but no one had ever truly understood those sacrifices. He wasn't just a strong father, a powerful man. He was a human being, someone with emotions, with pain. He could no longer live with this pain without releasing it. The tears fell, soaking into the earth, into the very rosebush he had nurtured all these years. The flowers continued to bloom, but in that moment, he felt like he was part of the garden, part of something that had been forgotten, lost in time. He sat down, his hands still resting on the trunk, his head bowed, letting the tears fall freely. Those tears weren't just weakness, they were a release. He no longer had to remain silent. Each tear felt like it washed away the pain in his heart, as if he were being renewed, freed from the burden of emotions he had kept suppressed for so long. When the crying subsided, the father stood up, looking at the garden, at the flowers that were still blooming. Though he still felt the pain, though he couldn't change the past, he realized that nothing was meaningless. Even if his daughter had drifted away, even if his son-in-law showed him no respect, the garden was still there, a testament to love and sacrifice. And he was still the father, the man his wife and daughter would always remember, no matter how much time passed. He left the garden and returned to his home, where the silence again took over. But his heart felt lighter, even though the pain remained. He knew that, even though no one recognized his sacrifices, he would continue to love, continue to live with the memories of his family, and though there would be moments of unbearable pain, he would never abandon what he had built, what he had given. The small house in the overgrown garden that the father had built with his own hands now stood silently in the dark of night. The space was quiet, no longer filled with the laughter of family or the lively conversations between him and his daughter. All that remained were the old walls, forgotten objects, and fading memories over time. The father sat in the living room, his tired eyes scanning the surroundings. Though he had grown accustomed to this silence, today the feeling of loneliness felt even more profound. After the heavy argument with his daughter, the father could feel the distance between them more than ever. Last night, when Emma left, he couldn't sleep. His daughter's words kept echoing in his mind, leaving him torn and restless. Had he been wrong to stay silent, to not express everything he was feeling? But no matter how angry he was, no matter how much he wanted to show his emotions, he couldn't. He was the father, the one who had devoted his life to his family, and he understood that protecting his daughter wasn't just about teaching her, but also about accepting sacrifice, about silently enduring those moments when words couldn't explain. Emma stepped into the house, her eyes now free of anger but still carrying a trace of worry. She walked across the threshold, noticing her father sitting there unmoving. The distance between them now felt like an invisible wall, thick and difficult to break. She had come back to apologize, to try to repair what had happened, but her heart was full of questions. Why was there such a distance between them now? Why hadn't she realized that her father had suffered more than she could imagine? "Dad," Emma spoke, walking toward the table where her father sat. "I I'm sorry for making you upset." The father merely nodded slightly, saying nothing. Emma's apology was like a breeze passing by, unable to ease the sadness in his heart. He had grown so accustomed to the silence in their conversations, so used to swallowing his emotions. But Emma hadn't realized that silence was the reflection of a heart that was breaking. He couldn't find the words to explain, couldn't tell her everything he had endured. She couldn't understand, and perhaps she never would, the sacrifices he had made for this family. "Dad," Emma spoke again, but this time her voice cracked with emotion. "I don't understand why there's this distance between us." "I don't know how I've hurt you." The father didn't respond, but his eyes turned to the small wooden box on the shelf, a box he hadn't touched in a long time. It was the box his wife had left behind before she passed away, a box filled with precious mementos from their family life. Emma followed his gaze and, without thinking, walked closer to the box. She didn't know that this box held secrets she had never known. She gently opened the lid of the box, revealing a thick layer of dust. As she wiped it away, an old letter and a small medal fell out. The letter was carefully sealed at the bottom of the box, its edges worn by time. The handwriting had faded, but it was still legible. "Thank you for saving us. Rescue Team 2003. Emma froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. She picked up the medal and studied it closely. It was a rescue medal, something she had seen in old photos but never understood its significance. This letter and medal were clearly from her father, but why had he never told her about this? Why had he kept such an important part of his past hidden? A feeling of confusion and shame flooded Emma's heart. She had no idea her father had been involved in a rescue operation, saving lives during a major disaster in 2003. This was a part of his past she had never been told about. She remembered growing up, how he was always busy with work, always working hard, but she had never known that he had once been a hero, saving dozens of lives in life-threatening situations. Emma reached out to touch the medal, but when she looked at her father, she didn't know what to say. In that moment, she felt as though she knew so little about the man she called Dad. She felt the sting of regret, realizing that she had judged him too quickly, had too easily criticized him without ever understanding the quiet sacrifices he had made for the family. "Dad," Emma choked, "why didn't you tell me about this? Why have you kept all of this from me, things I should have known long ago?" The father sat in silence, his eyes still fixed on the medal, but his heart was full of complex emotions. He had always wanted to protect his daughter from suffering, and he never wanted her to know about the pain in his past. The things he had done in the rescue operation were part of a past he didn't want to bring up, because they weren't just heroic acts, they were also the losses, the pain he had faced, the deaths, the injuries, the horrifying images from the disaster. These were parts of his life he wanted to bury, not expose his daughter to. "You don't need to know," the father said softly, his voice low and heavy. "I don't want you to worry about that. I just wanted you to have a peaceful life, not to bear things beyond your strength." Emma looked at him, feeling the pain in his words. She couldn't fully understand what her father had been through, but she could feel that he had endured so much. He wasn't just a simple father. He was a man who had sacrificed so much for his family without ever asking for recognition. "I'm sorry, Dad," Emma said, tears filling her eyes. "I've been so selfish. I didn't realize what you've done. I didn't understand all that you've sacrificed." The father didn't reply, only sitting in silence. His gaze wasn't sad or angry, but filled with exhaustion. He didn't need thanks from his daughter. He just needed her to understand that everything he did, even if it wasn't acknowledged, had always come from an endless love for her. The two of them sat there in silence, but this time there was no distance between them. Emma's tears were a sign of change, of opening her heart and understanding something she had never grasped before. And in that silence, the father realized that even if his daughter had grown up, even if she lived her own life, he would always be the father who loved her, always the man who would protect her, even if she could never fully understand everything he had done for her. Emma sat quietly in the living room of the house, the photograph and the medal in her hands, acting as symbols of a life she had never fully understood. The room was still, with nothing but the sound of her own breath, and the memories from the past she had never known. The words in the old letter, "Thank you for saving us. Rescue Team 2003," still echoed in her mind, but the feeling it stirred wasn't just surprise. It sparked a deep sense of regret and pain as she realized that her father, the man she once thought was just an ordinary father with no remarkable achievements beyond his hard work, had once been a true hero. She picked up the medal again, her eyes tracing the details on its surface, where the wear of time had smoothed out its rough edges. It felt like a testament to everything her father had endured. She realized that this wasn't just a medal. It was a part of her father that she had never fully understood, a part of him that had been kept hidden, even from his own family. She couldn't remember how many times she had seen that medal before. The image of her father in a rescue uniform, holding this very medal, had never appeared in any of the family stories he told. Whenever she asked him about his work, he always spoke vaguely, avoiding the topic. She had assumed these were dull stories he didn't wish to share, but now, as she realized he had risked his life to save others, everything suddenly became clear in her mind. She had often complained about how tired her father always was, how he never seemed to participate in family conversations, how distant and out of touch he seemed with her world. She had thought of him as just a regular man, living in a world completely different from hers, but now everything felt different. She felt like she was seeing a completely different father, not an old, tired man living by his hard labor, but a hero, someone who had once saved lives in extreme circumstances. Emma quietly stood up from the chair, walking toward the bookshelf where the old family photos were kept in simple frames. She pulled out a few photos and began flipping through them. These old photos were like doors opening to a past she had never seen. One photo showed her father with his rescue team, standing among the rubble after a heavy rainstorm had caused a landslide that swept away an entire village. Her father in that photo didn't appear frightened. His eyes were full of determination, though fatigue and tension were evident on his face. What surprised Emma was that despite the exhaustion, his eyes still held strength, never backing down in the face of any challenge. She flipped to another photo, this one showing him in a crowd, in the days following the landslide. In this photo, he wasn't just a rescuer, but a man being honored, someone being thanked by hundreds of people for saving their lives. The faces in the photo were filled with gratitude and admiration, looking at him with respect. But what stood out to her was that in all these photos, her father never smiled. He never sought praise. He never looked for recognition. That was just how he lived, quietly, humbly, always doing good without expecting thanks or acknowledgement. As Emma gazed at these photos, a deep regret washed over her. She had once resented him for never sharing these stories with her, for keeping everything to himself. But now she realized he didn't need to tell her. Her father was a man of action, someone who didn't need to boast about his accomplishments. The photos, the medals, the memories, They were all that mattered to him, a silent testament to his worth. She had never understood him, never realized that every time he worked tirelessly to provide for their family, every time he quietly labored to protect and care for them, that was his way of showing love. As these photos began to sink deeper into her mind, Emma couldn't help but turn her gaze toward her husband, who was standing by the door, as usual, with a cold, self-satisfied look on his face. He didn't see anything in her eyes now. He didn't realize the change in Emma, didn't see that she was looking at him differently, with eyes full of disappointment. She couldn't help but feel the contrast between her father and her husband. She had lived in a world she had always thought was complete, full of pride and success, but now she realized everything had been superficial. Her father, though unacknowledged, though never seeking praise, was the one with the sacrifices and the resilience she had never understood. Emma's eyes flashed with disappointment as she looked at her husband, not because of anything he had done wrong, but because she realized she had placed her trust in things that didn't deserve it. Her husband, no matter how successful or intelligent he was, could never offer her the warmth and love her father had given her all those years. She looked at her husband, her eyes filled with regret and guilt, as if the words and arguments she had had with her father before could never be erased. She wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. She wanted to explain to her husband that she had realized her mistakes, but she couldn't. She could only remain silent, blaming herself for not recognizing what was truly important in her life. She wanted to go back to her father, to hug him and apologize, but she knew that apologies couldn't undo the wounds that had already been caused. The room remained silent, with only the sound of Emma's steady breathing breaking the stillness. She stood before the desk, the weak afternoon light casting a soft glow on the metal and the old letter, silent witnesses to a past she had never fully understood. The entire space seemed to compress all the emotions inside her, and Emma couldn't hold back the flood of feelings that had built up over time. Each step she took echoed in the quiet room, but each step felt heavier, like a decision from which she couldn't turn back. As she placed the medal on the table, Emma still couldn't fully grasp the truth that had just been revealed. She wanted everything to pass in silence, but this awakening pushed her to a crossroads she couldn't avoid. Memories of her father suddenly flooded her mind, not sweet moments as she had imagined, but the silence, the exhaustion, and the isolation he had endured. And now, with these sacrifices exposed before her, she couldn't continue living in pretense. She couldn't continue wearing the mask of a loving daughter who didn't fully understand her father. She turned around, facing her husband, the one she had once thought was an integral part of her life. But now, as she stood facing him, a completely different feeling rose in her heart. He still sat there on the sofa, his work clothes unchanged, his eyes focused intently on the screen of his phone, completely oblivious to the tense atmosphere around them. He didn't recognize the change in her, didn't realize that everything between them was no longer the same. Emma couldn't bear his indifference any longer, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't understand her. He didn't understand the sacrifices her father had made to keep their family together, and he didn't understand why she felt so disappointed when witnessing his indifference toward the values she had just discovered. She walked toward the desk, placing the medal and the letter on it gently but with determination. Her gaze was fixed on her husband, offering no softness or hesitation. She had to face him, to confront what she could no longer avoid, knowing that everything could change after this confrontation. "What do you know about my dad?" Her question cut through the air, sharp like a knife, slicing through the tension. It wasn't a question meant to get an answer from him, but rather to make him face the truth she had discovered, and to help her confront her own realization. She wanted him to reassess himself and look back at how he had treated her family, especially the father she had never truly understood. The question made her husband falter. His eyes still didn't leave his phone, but now the silence seemed to claim the space. He didn't respond immediately, but from the furrowing of his brow and the slight lift of his head, Emma could sense clearly that he had no answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to face the question. He couldn't understand why she needed to ask, why a simple question could make her so tense. The silence stretched on, and Emma could feel the disappointment swelling inside her. In the past, she had overlooked his aloofness and lack of attention, but now she could no longer turn a blind eye. She couldn't let the disrespect toward her father continue. "You don't know anything," she said, her tone colder and more tense than before. "You don't know that my dad saved dozens of people during a landslide, that he risked his life to save them, and never even received a formal thank you." This time, her husband no longer pretended he hadn't heard. He looked up at her, his eyes showing a hint of surprise, but then he quickly dropped his gaze back to his phone, trying to avoid the confrontation. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Every second felt like an eternity, and Emma could feel herself unable to bear it any longer. She didn't need to say anything more. The silence had said it all. "You don't understand what my dad sacrificed," Emma continued, her words crashing down like a dam bursting, the pain flowing in each sentence. "My dad is a hero, but you don't know anything about him. You don't understand why I feel disappointed when I have to face someone I thought would stand by me." Her husband stopped scrolling through his phone, but still said nothing. He couldn't find any words to respond. His silence now was the clearest proof of his indifference, of the lack of respect he held for her family. He couldn't understand the importance of her father in Emma's life, couldn't see the sacrifices she had just discovered. And Emma now couldn't continue living in a relationship with someone she felt couldn't share the deeper values, the true emotions that meant so much to her. "You don't understand," Emma continued, her voice no longer weak, "and I can't accept this ignorance any longer." Her husband, still silent, lowered his head, unwilling to meet her gaze. He knew he couldn't give any reason, couldn't explain his actions. He knew that no matter what he tried to say, everything that had happened, the words Emma had spoken, and the emotions she was feeling were undeniable truths. The room remained silent. Emma stood there, facing her husband. But in her heart, she no longer felt the love she had once had for him. She felt as though she had just awoken from a long dream, the dream she had built of a perfect family, where everyone understood and respected each other. Now she realized that in order to have a truly happy family, it wasn't just love that mattered. It was understanding and mutual respect. Emma turned away, saying nothing more. She didn't need to explain herself anymore, didn't need to ask for change from her husband. This confrontation wasn't about finding reasons, but about seeing herself clearly, about understanding that a true man can love and respect his family not just through words, but through actions, through silent sacrifices that sometimes only time can reveal. The soft morning light filtered into the father's small garden, where everything remained unchanged. Yet the stillness of this morning felt subtly different. The rose bushes he had carefully nurtured for years continued to bloom, their vibrant red petals stretching toward the weak light as if to testify to his resilience and perseverance. The garden itself seemed to have a life of its own, a quiet but powerful stillness, much like the man himself, someone who lived quietly and loved deeply, yet never sought recognition. The father stood in the garden, pruning the branches with steady hands, each snip of the shears deliberate and patient. His movements were decisive but filled with care, each cut contributing to the perfection of the flowers. He didn't speak, only worked silently as he had always done. This silence might make others feel sad, but for him, it was the way he found peace within himself. The door creaked slightly as someone entered, and the father looked up, not with surprise or particular attention, but with a gentle, calm gaze. Emma's husband stood at the door without fanfare and without any signs of discomfort. He looked at the father, but this time, his gaze didn't hold the coldness or arrogance it once did. Instead, it carried a quiet recognition that Emma had never seen in him before. Still dressed in simple clothes, the son-in-law stepped into the garden without saying a word. The father continued his work, unfazed. The two men, though having had many conflicts before, now stood close to one another in silence. Neither spoke, Neither made any effort to break the stillness. The son-in-law didn't go to the chairs, but quietly picked up a hoe and began working beside the father, tending to the garden the father had built and maintained for years. This silence wasn't unfamiliar to the father. He was used to working alone in the garden, to tending to the flowers and everything around him without needing praise or recognition. But today, there was something different in this silence. The son-in-law, whom the father had once considered part of his family, didn't speak, didn't act awkwardly or try to please him. He just worked, quietly and persistently, much like the father had always done throughout his life. The air in the garden was so quiet that only the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind and the soft footsteps of the men could be heard. The father wasn't rushing. His gestures weren't hurried. He continued to prune each branch, continued tending to the garden as he had for many days before. But this time, he didn't feel lonely. The presence of the son-in-law, though silent, brought him a strange sense of comfort, a feeling that perhaps, little by little, things were changing. As the work neared completion, the father paused, setting the shears down on the ground. He looked at the son-in-law for a moment, not with exhaustion, but with the calm that only those who have lived long enough can understand. He knew that sometimes words weren't necessary, and things could change over time. Sometimes change came through the smallest actions. He looked at the son-in-law, his gaze full of patience, and after a moment of silence, he spoke. Value isn't in money, but in what you're willing to sacrifice for those you love. His voice was soft, but carried a depth of strength. These weren't words of reproach, nor were they criticism. They were a lesson from a man who had lived through many ups and downs in life. The father didn't need to explain or force anything. He simply shared a lesson life had taught him about the true values of love, sacrifice, and perseverance. The son-in-law, hearing these words, didn't immediately respond. He stood there, his head slightly bowed, not out of shame, but out of a silent recognition of what the father had said. He didn't need to answer, didn't need to explain. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of those words. What the father had said wasn't just simple words, but values deeply embedded in his life. Values about love, sacrifice, and resilience. The son-in-law lowered his head naturally, and in that action there was a respect he had never shown before. It wasn't guilt, nor was it pity. It was a quiet acknowledgement that what the father had done throughout his life wasn't easy, but was priceless sacrifice that not everyone could truly understand. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. In that moment, silence spoke volumes. The father didn't expect immediate change. He just quietly looked at the son-in-law, sensing the respect that he was now receiving. There was no anger, no reproach, only the calm of a man who had lived long enough to understand that not everything needed to be explained with words. Sometimes it was the silent actions that spoke louder than anything else. The son-in-law stood up, not offering an apology, but his eyes had changed. He no longer looked at the father with disdain or contempt. His gaze now carried respect, a recognition of what the father had done for the family, of the sacrifices he had never seen before. "Thank you," the son-in-law said, quietly but sincerely. It wasn't an apology, but a thank you from deep within. It was a thank you that didn't need to be repeated, for it had already been conveyed through his actions. The father looked at him, a small, gentle smile forming on his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but a smile of understanding. He knew that in this silence there had been a change, not a monumental change, but a small step in the long journey both of these men would now walk together. Finally, the garden was quiet again. The flowers continued to bloom. The rose bushes still stretched confidently under the sunlight. But this time, the garden wasn't just the place the father had tended to. It was also where the son-in-law had learned a valuable lesson about love, sacrifice, and respect. The early morning sun began to rise over the horizon, but its rays were still faint, not strong enough to dispel the chill of the dawn. The garden seemed to remain cloaked in stillness, where each tree and each leaf carried the marks of time. The roses, which the father had tended to for so many years, still bloomed, their bright red petals standing tall under the weak light, like a testament to his resilience and perseverance. The garden, with all its simplicity and humility, was the place where the father found peace and balance in his life. But today, the atmosphere in the garden felt a little different. The usual tranquility no longer stood alone. It was no longer solitary. Because beside the father stood Emma's husband, a man the father had never been fond of. But now he stood by his side, tending to the garden with a patience he had never shown before. The two men, though not speaking much, worked together, each with his own motions, but without interrupting the silence that enveloped them. The son-in-law, dressed simply, spoke no words of complaint or objection. He silently took the hoe, turning the soil around the tree roots, occasionally using shears to carefully trim the branches. He was not in a hurry, and there was no sign of impatience or discomfort. His gestures were gentle, as if trying to erase all the past mistakes and the lack of respect that had existed between them. He was not just caring for the garden. He was also tending to himself, rebuilding from what had been lost, from the wounds that couldn't be healed immediately. The father still said nothing, continuing with his familiar task, but his gaze no longer carried weariness or busyness. His eyes, though aged, now held calm and acceptance, qualities that only those who have lived long enough could understand. He didn't need to speak or instruct. All he wanted was simple actions showing change, maturity from those around him. The son-in-law's actions in the garden spoke for themselves. No words were needed, no apologies, just patience and care. As time passed, the flowers continued to bloom, the plants thrived, but it felt as though the atmosphere in the garden had shifted. The silence was no longer sadness or loneliness. It was harmony. The two men silently worked together, but they no longer felt like strangers, no longer distanced as they once had been. All misunderstandings, all separations seemed to be replaced by simple yet meaningful gestures. Emma unexpectedly stepped into the garden. She didn't know that when she returned today, she would witness such a different sight. Both the father and the son-in-law stood side by side, tending to the roses together, without saying a word, doing nothing but spending time together in the quiet. There were no arguments, no reproaches, only an unusual sense of peace. She stood at the garden's threshold, looking into this scene, her eyes widening, taken aback by the change. She said nothing, standing still for a moment, observing. She didn't need to ask why they were working together, nor did she need to find an explanation. Just by looking at this harmony, she understood that this was the first step in healing the wounds within the family. She smiled, a soft and happy smile. She didn't know what to say, but she felt a calmness spreading in her heart. The worries and disappointments gradually faded away, and she understood that not everything had to be resolved with words. Sometimes actions spoke louder than anything else. No need for an explanation, no need for any apology, just the sight of her father and her husband finding peace in their relationship. The way they tended to the garden wasn't just about caring for the plants. It was about nurturing a relationship that had once been hurt, about respect and understanding that didn't need to be spoken. Emma stood there, observing for a long while, and felt her heart lighter than ever before. She smiled gently, feeling this change within herself, within her father and her husband. Finally, she approached the two men, not with surprise or confusion, but with warmth and peace in her soul. She didn't need to say anything more, for she had seen everything she needed to see. She looked at her father, then at the son-in-law, the man she had once felt distant from. But now he was no longer the man she had once seen as indifferent. Now he was part of the family, someone who had shared these silent moments with her father. She walked over to her father, placing a hand on his shoulder, and with that smile, she softly said, "Thank you, Dad." Just 3 simple words, but they contained everything she felt in that moment. It wasn't a thank you for a material gift or a special action, but for the patience, for the calmness, for the love and sacrifice her father had given her. The father didn't respond with words, just a small smile, his gaze lingering on her for a moment, before he continued tending to the roses, needing nothing more. The entire garden, the flowers, the branches, were all symbols of the love and sacrifice he had given to this family. The son-in-law looked at Emma, and in his eyes there was a difference, not coldness, not indifference, but respect. He didn't say anything, but his silence was an apology and an acknowledgement of what he had been lacking. He lowered his head gently, not out of regret, but out of understanding, a true respect for his father-in-law. His eyes no longer held contempt, but a connection, a harmony that he had found through this process. Finally, the three of them, each in silence, stood together beneath the gentle sunlight of the morning. No words, no explanations, just peace, and that was all they needed. Together, they cared for the garden, living in understanding and respect. All three of them had found harmony, not through words, but through actions, through love that didn't need to be spoken. The scene in the small garden remained unchanged, but the morning light today seemed to carry an unusual warmth. The faint rays of the early sun pierced through the leaves, casting gentle light on the rose branches, turning the space into a peaceful sanctuary full of life. Each step taken by the father in the garden was unhurried, without rush, yet filled with patience and a care. The red petals still reached towards the sunlight, as if to remind everyone that new beginnings could emerge from slow, steady perseverance. In recent days, the garden had become the father's place of peace. But today, it wasn't just him in the garden. It was also the presence of the son-in-law, a man with whom the father had not shared the best relationship. Though they had not exchanged many words, the small actions they performed together had begun to change the atmosphere of the garden. Side by side, the son-in-law helped tend to the plants, trimming away the old branches. He didn't rush, nor did he show signs of fatigue. He simply worked quietly beside the father, not uttering a word. The light passed through the rose bush, making the dew on the petals glisten like tiny jewels. The entire space felt as though it had been rejuvenated by a gentle breeze. The father continued working, but today his actions seemed different. His eyes, no longer heavy with worry, now held a calm, an unexpected peace. Perhaps it was because of the son-in-law's quiet participation in tending to the garden that the father felt their relationship slowly mending. No words were exchanged, yet the son-in-law's actions spoke volumes. The son-in-law didn't apologize, didn't do anything overtly special except work alongside the father in the garden, but his actions didn't need explanation. Each gesture, lifting the hoe to till the soil, trimming the branches, carried a silent message of change and awareness. The two men worked side by side in a quiet, moving stillness. It wasn't the silence of unresolved conflict, but the silence of harmony, sharing, and respect. Emma entered the garden unexpectedly, and what she saw made her heart skip a beat. She never imagined she would witness such a scene. Her husband, whom she had thought would never find common ground with her father, was standing next to him, both working together in the garden the father had spent years nurturing. No words, no tension, just a quiet presence, as if everything had finally fallen into place. Emma stood for a moment at the garden gate, watching the two men. She didn't need any explanation, didn't need to understand everything that had happened between them in recent days. She simply needed to see this scene, to know that her father and husband had begun to understand one another, to change in ways words could never fully capture. She smiled, a soft smile, not rushed, not filled with intense joy, but a smile of peace, of contentment, realizing that family could overcome all struggles, even if it took time. She didn't say anything, didn't approach immediately. She just stood there observing, as if needing a brief moment of silence to feel the change within herself and in their relationship. This moment didn't require any more explanations. Emma understood that what she was witnessing wasn't an immediate healing, but a gradual change through simple, patient actions. This was how her father and husband had started to rebuild their relationship, one small step at a time. Finally, the father lifted his head, his eyes gentle but still full of quiet strength. His gaze met the son-in-law's, and in that look there was no need for words, just understanding and respect. The son-in-law didn't speak, just looked back at the father, no longer cold or arrogant. He bowed his head not in shame, but in recognition and respect. Emma moved closer to them, her eyes still filled with relief, but this time without worry or disappointment. She felt the change within herself. Over the past days, she had worried, thought that nothing could be healed, that things between her father and husband would never change. But now she saw that love and patience could do what no words could express. She approached, placed her hand on her father's shoulder, her gaze gentle and full of gratitude. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, not just thanking him for everything he had done for the family, but also for the patience and sacrifice he had given her. The father didn't respond with words, just a small smile. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he continued to tend to the roses, needing no further words. The garden, the flowers, the branches, everything was a symbol of the love and sacrifice he had given this family. The son-in-law looked at Emma, and this time his gaze held no coldness or indifference, but true respect. He didn't need to say anything, didn't need to do anything special. His eyes said it all. It was the look of a man who had changed, who understood that love doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes small but sincere actions are enough. The three of them stood there in silence, needing no more words. The garden wasn't just a place where they cared for the flowers. It was where they cared for their relationship, where they found harmony without needing explanation. Emma looked at the two men in her life, and in that moment she understood that nothing was more precious than true respect and love. There were no dialogues, no noise, just the fading light and the image of the three men standing together, their faces calm and peaceful. The camera paused on the family photo where the father, daughter, and son-in-law stood close, smiling gently. This was a photo that didn't need explanation, no further confirmation. Just those moments were enough. The father gave a truly peaceful smile. It was a smile of acceptance, sacrifice, and love. No more words were needed. No explanation was required to understand that love and sacrifice transcend all wounds, overcoming every conflict to bring peace. The final silence leaves the audience with a profound message about family relationships, the power of unspoken love, and how we heal the wounds in our hearts, one step at a time. In the end, what has passed leaves a deep mark in all of us. In a story about revenge, deep wounds are not only healed with words or regret, but through silent actions, unspoken sacrifices. Revenge does not always manifest through harm, but sometimes it is the way we find peace within ourselves and in relationships once torn apart. This lesson is not about revenge, but about the power of forgiveness and sacrifice. Fathers, mothers, and those who love us sometimes only need a little respect and understanding to heal all wounds. And from those silent moments, from actions without words, we realize that love does not always need to be spoken. Sometimes action, sometimes understanding is enough. This story is not to teach us how to seek revenge or retaliation, but to remind us that the greatest wounds in life can be healed in ways we never expected. And in the silence and small acts of love, we learn how to forgive, how to live more peacefully with ourselves and with those we love. We can all learn something from this story, whether about family, love, or sacrifice. But not just in this story, but in our own lives. These moments will help us realize that revenge is not the only way to face the wounds. Remember, only when we know how to love and sacrifice can we truly heal. And what about you? How do you feel about this story? Are there any wounds in your life that you haven't yet healed? Share your thoughts below this video so we can share, learn from each other, and together find peace within ourselves.